I'm Betsy Brewer, and I'm the head of the International Office, and I'm very happy to welcome you here tonight to the annual Ivan and Janice Stone Lecture. And let me talk a little bit about Ivan and Janice before I introduce our speaker for tonight. So Ivan and Janice Stone, in whose name tonight's lecture is held, would have been thrilled to attend today's International Symposium, to know that the college's commitment to international education remains robust, and to see so many international students enrolled at the college. The Stones' lives were entwined with Beloit College as it was just beginning to pursue internationalization. Ivan helped make this internationalization a reality, while Janice, after Ivan's death, worked to create a legacy gift that would ensure that the college retained an international dimension. Part of that gift supports this annual lecture. Ivan Stone taught for many years at the college, chairing the government department and the college's international relations concentration. He also served as the dean. Particularly relevant to this week's celebration of international education, Professor Stone was the first director of the college's World Outlook Center, which was the predecessor to today's Office of International Education. The establishment of the center signaled the decision to expand teaching about the world beyond the U.S. and to add new language offerings. To quote from a 1987 article in the Beloit Daily News, Ivan Stone was the kind of teacher who opened the eyes of his students. He expanded their vision and widened their horizons. He made them see the world, to look beyond boundaries. Like her husband, Janice Shrimpton Stone was an advocate for international education and experience. At the same time, both she and her husband strongly believed in engagement at the local level and were active in campus and community affairs. When Ivan and Janice gave their gift to the college, times were tough, and the Stones were deeply concerned that the college might turn inward and away from the wider world because of financial constraints. A stipulation of their gift, therefore, was that an annual lecture on international affairs be held. Now that international education is seen as central to Beloit College's identity and mission, it might be easy to overlook the importance of Ivan and Janice Stone's work and gift. But the opportunities students have today to engage internationally, and events such as tonight's talk and this week's celebration of international education are very much a legacy of their work, their vision, and their commitment of their personal resources. I'd now like to introduce Frederic Wehrey, who's our lecturer tonight. He's a senior associate in the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He focuses on political and security affairs in the Gulf. He focuses on Libya and on U.S. policy in the Middle East. He has numerous Carnegie publications and was a policy analyst at the Rand Corporation, where he wrote on domestic roles of Iran's Revolutionary Guards, Saudi-Iranian rivalry, and the strategic impact of the Iraq War in the Middle East. His book, Sectarian Politics in the Gulf, From the Iraq War to the Arab Uprising, was published by Columbia University Press in 2013 and was named one of the top 5 books on the Middle East by Foreign Policy magazine in that year. And it's this topic, sectarian conflict in the Persian Gulf, that he's going to discuss tonight. So please join me in welcoming Frederic Wehrey to Beloit College.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction, especially for the invitation to be here in the context of this international affairs event that you're holding, and especially in the context of the very generous Stone lectureship. I'm very honored to fill that. I'm a big fan of obviously international education, and especially liberal arts education. I benefited from this as a liberal arts college student back in the 90s. Did a semester abroad at Cairo University, studied in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and it really opened my eyes to a region that I knew nothing about, and especially the nuances of understanding identities in this region. And I can't tell you enough how that benefited me later on, more than a decade later, when I went to Iraq as a military officer in 2003, and I was confronted in a very visceral and real way with this notion of identities in the Middle East, and especially this notion of sectarianism, the Shia-Sunni conflict that I'm going to be talking about today, and how I think that grounding in a liberal arts education, being able to understand that there's more beneath the surface, to apply critical thinking skills to what you hear as received common wisdom, I think is so important. And today, if you follow the news, you would realize, you would recognize that much of the common wisdom about this region, at least, is that it is tearing itself apart at the seams. These two sects of Islam seem to be at each other's throats, the Shias and the Sunnis, in virtually every part of this region. Obviously, with the rise of the Islamic State, this brutal sectarian jihadist entity, this quasi-state that seems to be rolling through vast swaths of territory in Syria, in Lebanon. Many have said that this is just the way it's always been, that we look at the history of this region, it's been rife with tribal and religious rivalries, and this split within Islam, this Sunni-Shia split, is simply a continuation of a struggle that has been going on for thousands of years. This is just the modern manifestation of it. We've seen other instances in the modern period after the 1979 Iranian Revolution, during the Iraq Civil War, after the American invasion of that country in 2003. We find, obviously, that many senior U.S. officials are drawn to a reading of the Middle East, an interpretation of the Middle East that privileges sectarian identity. We hear President Obama in some of his speeches at the United Nations. He gave a State of the Union address last year, and he attributed Bahrain's violence, this tiny island in the Persian Gulf that I focus on, to sectarian tensions, that this is the reason for the violence there. But what I want to argue today is that we need to peel back the layers of this religious conflict and really look at causes, the identities and these religious tensions. What they really are is symptoms, I think, as symptoms of something else, something deeper, and that's what I want to talk about today. I think we ignore, when we focus on the Sunni-Shia split, we ignore the root causes. We ignore the role of poor governance in mobilizing identities and the role of weak institutions. So what we think is really primordial identities, that people have latched onto these identities for eons, for centuries. Really, these identities surface in times of crisis, in times of conflict. People latch onto them. I think we can all agree that people in this regions have multiple identities. They can be the member of a nation, they can be the member of a tribe, an ethnic group. So the question is, why has the Shia-Sunni split become so prevalent? Why has it become a mobilizing factor for conflict in the Middle East today? And to understand why that is, we need to move beyond simple religious explanations. What are the differences between these two sects? As it says up here, they differ really over succession to the Prophet Muhammad. There's differences in rituals. If we go through history, there's a lot of other differences related to class, related to how Persia became really the embodiment of Shiism. But I'm going to argue those differences, those doctrinal religious differences, are secondary to what we have to look at, and that's really the role of governance in this region. Are there institutions in this region that give people a sense of security, that give people a sense of voice in their government, that treat people equally, that don't discriminate? When those institutions are not there, and they are not there in this region, then these identities, the Shia-Sunni split, becomes very prominent, and it becomes toxic, and it becomes violent. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing states break down in this region, obviously the case of Syria, in Iraq, in other states where there are Shias and Sunnis living side by side, in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, where the Shia are a minority, in Kuwait. There's intense discrimination. These are authoritarian regimes. The ruling families do not grant privileges to all of their citizens. Sectarianism is a part of life there. It's also really a ruling strategy, and this, I think, is a key point in my book that I talk about. What we find in this region is that complete chaos and breakdown, state breakdown in a number of states, in the Levant, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Libya. I was just there in the summer. And then there's this sort of region of tranquility, the exceptional states, the monarchies that have largely bypassed the Arab uprisings, the Arab revolutions. And what you find in this cluster of states is that the monarchy, ruling family of these states, use sectarian narratives in their media, in their official discourse, to say, look at the region around you. It's collapsing amidst tribal and sectarian fighting. But because we have monarchies here, because we have these that rule over these divided citizens, that's not happening. And they say citizens want to go down the path of upsetting the apple cart. Do you really want to try civilization? Look where it got you in Iraq. They have. And I think this is a very insidious narrative that we find, that because of these identities, people are not ready for participatory government. They're not ready for democracy. There is perhaps some merit to that. Premature democratization does lead to great instability. But we have to understand that sectarianism is used as a ruling strategy in a number of states in this region, and especially the three states that I'm going to focus on today: Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. These have played that card very, very, very well. I think if we look at this region, we can argue that there were really three waves of sectarianism when the Shia-Sunni split became prominent in the modern period. Talk to people in a place like Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. A lot of times you talk to ordinary citizens and they weren't aware who's a Shia or Sunni. They worked side by side. There was intermarriage. People worked together in the same business. But then they put this catalytic seminal event that happened. And suddenly people split. They were aware of who was a Shia. They were aware of who was a Sunni. And that was the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Those of you that are old enough to remember it, it was obviously an earthquake in this region. You had the toppling of the monarchy, the Shah. You had an aggressive, expansive, revolutionary power come to the fore in the Middle East. Khomeini was bent. He made it his strategy on toppling the monarchies in the Gulf. But more importantly, this was a Shia power. And some of them seemed to be on the march. And suddenly these identities, Shia Sunni identities, became catalyzed. They became amplified. Shia minorities in the Gulf that had long been oppressed, that had long been in Bahrain, that comprised 70% of the population, Saudi Arabia, they were an example of Iran and began receiving support, training. They began mobilizing. They began protesting. So this wildfire of the Iran caught fire, and it seemed like Shiism was suddenly on. Saudis were petrified. In response, they obviously supported Iraq during its bloody 8-year war with Iran during the 1980s. But more importantly, the Saudis began mobilizing discourse. They began mobilizing their Sunni clerics, their Salafi, Wahhabi Sunni clerics, to try to demonize the Shiites, to try to offset Iran's appeal in the region. They began through sermons, through tape recordings, through pamphlets, and a very aggressive anti-Shia campaign to delegitimize the Islamic Republic, to isolate it from the rest of the Arab world. And this is sort of the first wave of sectarianism that we see in the region. And many of these still floating around today, and they're from that first wave of sectarianism that the Saudis really sponsored against the Iranians. The second wave of sectarian strife in the region, of Sunni-Shia strife, really began, of course, after the 2003 Iraq invasion by the United States. There is this argument that authoritarian rulers play it very well, that President Assad and President Saddam, in all of their failings, for all of their brutality, they kept a lid on sectarian identities. They kept a lid on these populations. And when they were challenged, when their rule was eroded in the case of Syria, or when they were toppled in Iraq, these identities came to the fore. There's a little bit of logic to that argument. More importantly, we have to look at what was going on beneath the surface. They were keeping a lid on things, but beneath the surface, those identities were there. They were being mobilized. It was sort of a piece of the graveyard. So Saddam Hussein's regime is toppled. You begin having the rise of Shia parties in Iraq that were backed by Iran. You began having the rise of al-Qaeda in Iraq. Abu Zarqawi, who was the state, and you began having Iraq's descent into civil war because there were no institutions available that could mediate sectarian tensions. Zarqawi, in his campaign, was virulently anti-Shiite. He killed Shiite civilians. And this explosion of civil war in Iraq reverberated across the region. And again, it was a second sort of catalyzation of sectarian identities in the region. And you felt it when you traveled throughout the region, that people were suddenly aware of. The important thing I want to mention about this second wave is that it coincided with the rise of social media, the proliferation of social media. Previously in this region, in the 80s, if Saddam Hussein or somebody carried out a massacre of a rival ethnic group or a sectarian group, or if, for instance, President Assad in Syria, when he massacred Muslim Brotherhood supporters in Hama, nobody oftentimes knew about it. But now, with the rise of social media, it becomes instantaneous. It becomes theater. People are immediately plugged into it. It reverberates. And what does that do to identities? It creates an echo chamber where suddenly these identities matter. People latch onto them. So you had this happening around the time of 2006, 2008, when Iraq's civil war between Shias and Sunnis really to a tipping point. Of social media has really magnified them and enabled to flourish. The third wave of sectarianism in the region, and this is where we're at today, coincided with the 2011 Arab uprisings. Now, as we know from the history of they as a sectarian-driven phenomena. Obviously, they started in Tunisia and Egypt. We know the motives behind them, poor governance, economic motives, corruption. But when the Arab uprisings spread to the Gulf, and they actually did spread to the Gulf, guess who were the ones that protested in the Gulf? They were the Shiites, because the Shiites had long been at the margins of society. They were the poorest, ones that were discriminated against economically, religiously. So you did have the Pearl Roundabout uprising in Bahrain in February of 2011. You had scattered protests in the Shia areas of eastern Saudi Arabia. But what's interesting to note about these protests is that when they started, when the Shiites began them, they didn't frame protests as sectarian. They didn't say we want Shiite rights, we want rights for the Shiites. They were framed at very broad-based reforms. They said we want judicial reforms, we want the release of political prisoners, we want a constitution, we want housing. And they tried to recruit Sunnis. They tried to be very inclusive. But what happened very quickly is that these protests were seen suddenly, and they were portrayed in the official media as Shiite only. They were seen as sectarian. They were being the official regime narrative was, well, these are the Shiites pushing for Shiite rights, and guess what? They're being backed by Iran. And this was a very, very poisonous but effective used by regimes to discredit these movements for change in the Gulf. And gradually, what were originally popular, broad-based, even class-based movements in the Gulf quickly became what I call sectarianized. They acquired a sectarian hue, partly because of regime strategies. So this is sort of the start of the third wave of sectarianism, really escalated with the breakdown of Syria, with the collapse of or threat to the Assad regime, with the rise of the Syrian opposition, with Assad's strategy in managing that war in which he deliberately played Sunni and Shia off against one another, with the arrival of Hezbollah in Syria with what became essentially a regional proxy war in Syria, where you had the Saudis and the Gulf states backing the Sunnis, Iran backing Shiite, backing Assad with Hezbollah fighting. And that war also reverberated across the region. It is reverberating. The real wave sectarianism in the Middle East is that it is no longer controlled by states. Non-states are calling the shots here. Iraqi militias have their own sectarian narrative that they're playing, especially, we all know, the Islamic State. This is what certainly occupies Washington, where I come from. You can't get away from it. It's the topic du jour. We can talk about it if we're overestimating this threat. But this is a very powerful movement that is obviously threatening the sovereignty of states in the Middle East, that has a very powerful propaganda machine, that is explicitly in its worldview sectarian. We've seen the horrific images of massacres of Shiite soldiers. But we have to look at its origins. How did it arise? Why is it so powerful? Because of sectarian disenfranchisement. Who are its supporters? Sunnis in western Iraq who felt excluded by Maliki's very, very sectarian rule. Because of power, they were ripe really for exploitation by this movement that came in. So it's really a movement for Sunni empowerment. So again, the roots of ISIS, if we want to look at the real roots of it, we can argue a bit about, we could talk about, was it the premature withdrawal of US forces from Iraq? Was it a legacy of Al-Qaeda? But I think it was really the result of a very sectarian policy by the Baghdad government, by Maliki, of disenfranchising the Sunnis, of keeping them out of power, of criminalizing politicians, of going after them, of really breaching the Sunnis' trust that made them ripe for this exploitation by ISIS. So many of the Sunnis that are ISIS say, this is not a great movement. We're not happy living under these very draconian social mores. Obviously, there's incredible brutality. But guess what? Maliki was even worse with his Shia triumphalism, with his very sectarian policies. So again, understanding the role of governance and institutions, I think, is absolutely critical to understanding why and how sectarianism becomes a factor of the Middle East conflict environment. It's very interesting. I think, obviously, when you study a region, it's important to obviously listen to the voices within that region that are attempting to make sense of the conflicts and the tensions. So I tried in my research to understand, to go through a lot of Arabic web commentary, opinion pages, to understand how Arab scholars, Arab opinion shapers are dealing with this phenomenon of sectarianism. Where do they see its roots? How did it come arise? How did it come about? And what's very interesting is that, by and large, many of these writers are writing in the Gulf-sponsored press, so there's sort of an implicit bias. But many of them attribute sectarianism to outside meddling. So the idea is that these states, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the Sunnis and Shias, were living in relative peace. But there was some outside power that began stirring things up and increasing tensions. And that outside power, 90% of the time, is the Islamic Republic of Iran. The Arabs are pinning the blame for sectarianism on Iran without actually shining the light on domestic policies and saying, what's wrong with our own societies? What's wrong with our governance? What's wrong with our economies? Why do we have these identity problems? Again, pinning the blame on an outside power. Another interesting dynamic here going on that you find often in Arab circles and sort of floating around the street. And this is the idea, and it really stems from the legacy of colonial rule in the Middle East under the British and French, where in fact, and the French did pursue very manipulative policies where they favored one ethnic group over another, where they favored one sectarian group over another as a divide and rule strategy. They did this. But there are many Arabs in the press today that think that sectarianism is really a product of the United States. This is a cartoon, and you've got the Shia guy on the left, the Sunni guy on the right. They're at each other's throats. But guess who's really, manipulating that conflict? The United States. So there's this idea out there that somehow the United States is stoking these conflicts to divide the Arabs, to divide the Ummah, to divide the Muslim world, to better rule it. Now, it seems fantastical to us, but if you look at U.S. policies, we were the ones that overthrew Saddam Hussein. Strategy right now in fighting the Islamic State, Arabs seem to be helping minorities. We're helping out the Kurds, we're helping out the Yazidis, we're helping out the Baghdad government. If you look at conducting airstrikes against ISIS, we're not conducting airstrikes in Sunni areas in Iraq. So there's this narrative going around among many Sunnis that, hey, what's the U.S. doing here? The U.S. is trying to divide us amongst each other. It's playing favorites. It's supporting minorities against the Sunnis. I think as someone who obviously goes to the region a lot and tries to look at these narratives, we're never going to be able to escape from these conspiracy theories completely. They're going to be out there. It's really a product of the information environment. But I do think the United States can do more in terms of addressing the root causes of sectarianism in the region, and especially not falling into the trap of looking at this region in terms of Sunnis and Shias. I work in the policy realm, and it's very, the attention of policymakers. They don't have the luxury of being in sort of this rich academic setting where you can discuss and critique and challenge narratives. You're dealing on a bandwidth and a time span that is so accelerated and so narrow, and policymakers have so little time that to explain this region to them, how do you do it in 5 minutes? Well, it's often easy to say Shias and Sunnis. And so this is a very lazy way of looking at things. So again, I don't think the United States should look at this region solely in terms of Shia and Sunni. We need to get to the root causes of why these identities come to the surface. And in my work, that's what I really try to do. And I'll go through some of these, what I call the institutional roots of sectarianism. And I think there's a lot of value. I've been to workshops in Washington, D.C. with various policymakers, and people they are still thinking about political reform in the Middle East as a priority for the United States. But unfortunately, I don't think the agenda carries much weight now. We're obviously focused on other things. We've got ISIS threat. We've got Iran. So for U.S. policymakers to focus on telling these Arab regimes, our Arab, you need to clean house. You need to get your house in order. You need to open up political space. It's unfortunately not a very high priority right now. But I'm going to argue because we know what can happen inside these societies if they're left to ferment. We know that radicalization occurs. And it's also of sectarianism. I think why does sectarianism occur in these states, especially in the Gulf? It's the fundamental lack of real participatory governance. People don't have an outlet for voicing their opinion. They don't have a buy-in in government. So they revert to these identities. These are the identities that they know. In many of the states, in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, there are very cosmetic democratic institutions. There are parliaments, there are consultative councils, but they don't really do much in terms of legislate, in terms of hold governments. And they become sort of vehicles for sectarianism. Another important source of sectarianism in this region is issues of land ownership and provincial discrimination. A lot of times what we think of as religious discrimination is actually center versus periphery. Many of these groups are concentrated in outlying areas outside of the capital, and of infrastructure, funding, of development, important source of labor market. In these areas, the underclass. So there's a class-based dimension to their discrimination. Security forces in the militaries. This is absolutely a key problem in many of these countries. In Bahrain, many of the grievances behind the uprising in 2011 was because the Shia were not represented in the security forces in Bahrain. In the Sunni minority country, the Sunni monarchy basically brought in Sunni foreigners from Pakistan, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Syria to fill the ranks of the security force. And so the Shia didn't feel like they had a say in their own policing. They weren't part of the organs of policing. They weren't part of the army. The same thing in Saudi Arabia in the Eastern province. All local police were Sunnis from other provinces. And I think this is a real source of tension. Education is another important sphere. What you find in the education systems in many of these countries, in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, is that there's a dominant Sunni religious discourse that denies the Shia equal rights. Shia school children are going to these schools and they're told in the religious education that they're following a heretical belief. In some cases, they're given doctrines that allow violence against them. And again, this is a key source of tension. And then, of course, the religious and cultural sphere. There have been some improvements in this area in terms of allowing the Shia to practice their rituals, have their own laws, have a long way. Gulf, realize that you open the spigot on acknowledging religious diversity, you're traveling down that slippery slope of reform, you're challenging the monarchical system. And these are regimes that are facing, I think, very, very severe legitimacy crises on a number of fronts, and they're very reluctant to go down that front. And sectarianism is a very useful strategy for them, as I mentioned earlier. One thing I mentioned, or I noticed during my time doing interviews in the Gulf, tackling this issue of sectarian identity, is a very actually encouraging phenomenon among many youth activists, among many Shia youth activists that I encountered in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, where they were trying to sectarian divides. They were trying to reach out to Sunnis. They were trying to find common ground with like-minded youth. If you're a youth in the Gulf right now, in a place like Saudi Arabia, you're facing a very dire economic future. The benefits, the welfare state that was afforded to your parents may not be available to you. There's a tremendous youth bulge in these countries. Employment, the education system is not young people to compete in the global economy. This is an argument that I'm putting forward, is that you may have a post-sectarian generation arise. These younger people that I talk to, they're not as concerned often with the differences in their religion. They're not often concerned with clerical authority. They're not bound by the same sort of prejudices that afflicted their fathers and mothers. And so they're mobilizing. They're talking to each other on social media. They're forming like-minded youth networks. And I think this is a source of perhaps guarded optimism, that the farther away we get from the Iranian Revolution, from these very sectarian events, we may enter a post-sectarian age in the Gulf. So again, empowering this, they're using it to communicate. The a source of potential optimism. Where are we going in the future? We can talk in the question and answer period about the so-called breakdown of this region. Are the borders going to be withdrawn? Many people have said that this is the end of the post-colonial system. The Sykes-Picot system is breaking because of the Islamic State. We're seeing new forms of identity emerge. The Kurds have their own state in the north. You've got, obviously, the breakup of Syria. The entire region seems to be breaking apart. I'm going to argue that that is certainly occurring. The region is no longer the way it was. But I think the actual are still fairly solid. And I think it would be a mistake to sort of look at this map in terms of blocks of ethnic groups or sectarian groups. Some people have even said that you have a united Shia stance. You'll have southern Iraq with the Shia areas of Bahrain, with the Shia areas of Saudi Arabia. This is sort of armchair strategizing. I mean, it doesn't get into the real differences on the ground. Even the Shia communities in these countries are divided. The Shia of Bahrain are not like the Shia of Iran. They have theological, doctrinal differences. So again, to think of this region as blocks of religious groups or blocks of ethnic groups is very misleading. Kurds are tremendously divided as well. But I think we are in a very dangerous period right now. Sectarianism is alive and well. I think U.S. policy, as a matter of practice, should not get involved in terms of deciding religious affairs and just in terms of deciding what is the correct Islam, in terms of meddling in religious affairs. But what we can address through our policies is the root causes that I talked about. Demanding from these Arab allies that we're partnering with more concrete political reforms. To tell countries like the Saudis, who partnered with us against ISIS, who are presenting themselves as this counterterrorism ally against the Islamic State, you're doing that, but at the same time you need to look internally, domestically, at what's happening within your own society and look at the way in which your own policies may be feeding sectarianism and radicalization inside your own borders. This is going to be a generational challenge, I think. But again, I think it's one that the United States needs to focus on to really get at the roots of the current tension. We know that what happens inside the borders of these states doesn't just stay in the region, but it can United States as well. So I'll close there, and we can certainly open it up for questions, and a lot of material, but I'm happy to answer questions.
Thanks so much. We have a microphone if you have questions.
All right, so anyone's questions, just speak in the mic. Is strictly for the stream, so you're not going to be broadcast, but we're going to go one by one, and I'll come around with the mic to anyone who would like to ask a question.
This summer you said you went to Libya. I was just curious to know what you did there.
Yeah, I do research there. So I've been writing a lot on the militias, on the breakdown of Libya. So yeah, I was there in the eastern part. I was in Tripoli. So it's part of my job. I was looking at the ongoing violence. And yeah, Libya is another case where, well, I mean, we can talk about was it right for the United States to assist in the overthrow of Gaddafi, and this notion of we decapitated a regime, but we didn't follow through with the post-invasion. You know, there's a lot of speculation. Was it worth it? Should Obama have done more? If you saw Obama's interview with Tom Friedman, the New York Times, he said this is why my one big regret. I'm sure he has many, but one of his big ones was not following through with Libya.
Fred, could you talk a little bit more about sort of where you ended in terms of sort of working towards concrete political reforms? Because I guess I'm curious about what you see as being sort of the sort of leverage points that we have, and also sort of where you see the political will coming from in the United States for that kind of work.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is the problem. I think, after 9/11, you had this big push under the Bush administration for the democracy agenda. And I mean, the problem is that's sort of been tainted by association with the neocon agenda. So, I mean, we're not talking about pushing democracy on these states. We're talking about rule of law, governance. I do see real appetite for that among foreign policy professionals in the State Department. I mean, there are a number of programs ongoing. We're doing it very quietly. We're supporting civil society groups. We're, even in places where it's hard to do. I was on the phone the other day with the U.S. consul in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, which is the eastern part where the Shia are, and they were talking to me about the Shia and the reform. And they're engaged in some very quiet outreach to the Shia. They're trying to push the Saudis to reform some of their anti-terrorism laws. And so what you hear in Washington is the priority is obviously ISIS, but we're having conversations. So we're having conversation with our partners about the need to do X and Y. You're right. I mean, this issue of what kind of sticks do we bring, not a lot in this region. I mean, especially given the fact that the Saudis have enormous economic clout. They're buying our weapons. They're an important part of the, American economy with the arms industry. So in a place like Bahrain, I mean, obviously an important concern for this college because of the alumni connection to Zainab al-Khawaja. I've argued that the U.S. should get a little firmer in terms of its military assistance. We can withhold certain arms sales until the Bahrainis do X, Y, and Z. We've already tried to do that a bit. There are some other pressure points we can use. The problem in the case of Bahrain, I didn't mention this, but Bahrain is the home to the U.S. Fifth Fleet. This is a massive U.S. naval presence, naval base in Bahrain. We have command and control there. It's an essential part of our power projection in the Persian Gulf from a naval perspective. And so we're reluctant to push too hard on that because we need the Bahrainis for that military access in the region. So this is a fundamental problem in American foreign policy, the tension between idealism and realism. And it's, I just think we know from history that we're focused on this near-term threat of ISIS, but meanwhile, there are these things brewing beneath the surface that may come back to bite us in the long term. So.
Thanks. I'm curious about your observations about the current generation of young people in these countries. And you mentioned that having a hope that these people might be able to transcend the Shia, Sunni, or other divides that exist in their society. But at the same time, at the beginning, you mentioned 3 different cases within the last 40 years where those divides resurged and came back to the light. So I wonder if there is something different among the young population today that gives you that hope that might not be the case again in 10, 15, 20 years from now?
No, that's a very good point. I mean, I think the real difference about this younger generation is education. That many of them, I mean, the Gulf states, actually Saudi Arabia, they undertook a massive program to send people abroad. So many of these young people that I mentioned that are doing this sort of outreach were educated abroad. They were exposed to Western ideas. I think the difference in the past is that it was much harder to, I think it was just harder to get outside information. It was harder to be exposed to the world. It's just easier now to have different information influences. And I find that, I'm not a student of information, communications and social media. I don't want to impart too much power to that, but I do think it's having an effect in terms of broadening people's worldview, in terms of building bridges with other communities. You're seeing this. Will sectarianism ever go away? No. I mean, I think that, as I mentioned, it's really about inclusive governance. People are always going to have these identities, but it's about giving them institutions where they can be managed, have a say in the government, where these identities don't become toxic. I had a very interesting conversation with a social scientist who studied sectarianism in the Irish context, Protestant versus Catholic. And he came up with this framework for understanding identity. He called, on the one hand, there are what's called the primordial pessimists, meaning we look at these identities, they're primordial, they go back to ancient times, there's no escaping them. I mean, no matter what kind of governance you have, no matter what politicians do, people are going to be Shias, they're going to be Sunnis, trapped by these identities. It denies agency to political actors. And then on the other hand, there's what's called the instrumental optimists, meaning, no, these identities are in fact shaped by political actors, by media, by elites. I don't know if you're a Sunni or Shia, but our politicians tell us we are, and the media tells us we are, and that's why we're suddenly hating each other. That's one extreme. So where's reality? Probably in the middle somewhere. I don't want to deny that these identities don't matter, but I do think they've been inflated through manipulation by elites. They've been inflated because of media, because of poor governance.
So this is going in a slightly different direction, but I'm curious if sectarianism, of course not the Shia-Sunni conflict necessarily, but if sectarianism is a big issue in North Africa, Egypt, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, a different kind of divide perhaps.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I think it's a different kind of divide. I mean, Libya, no. I mean, they're all Sunni Muslims there. There's no ethnic. There's a few Berbers, Amazigh Berbers in the western part. There's ethnic Tuareg in the south. There's Tab. They're a black African minority in the south down here. But the ethnic dimension is not very prevalent in Libya. What you have in Libya is regional divides. There's sort of regional differences. The Easterners speak a different dialect. There's the center, Misrata. There's Westerners. So there's sort of regional divide. It's not this sort of virulent, ethnic or sectarian conflict that you see in Syria or Iraq. Egypt, if you've been to Egypt, I mean, there are real regional divides. The Southerners are different than the Northerners. But the main divide there is between the Copts and the Muslims, the Coptic Christians. There was tremendous violence and sectarianism in the south among Copts. And so, I mean, that's an ongoing problem there. The other states, not really. Algeria has a Berber issue as well. But sectarianism, the way we define it is primarily the Levant, Iraq, and the Gulf.
So early on, you mentioned that the sort of the narrative that the monarchies give is that
Right.
the sectarian issue is sort of caused by outside
Right.
instigation, like Iran. And to what extent sort of is that true? Sort of how much of it is actually Iranian, meddling or mobilization, and how much of it is sort of homegrown, the Shias mobilizing themselves?
Exactly. It's a huge issue. Look, I mean, I won't deny that Iran during the 1980s and partly into the 90s, they did have a strategy of backing local Shia groups, of giving them training, of inciting through the media. I mean, they were the ones that set up Hezbollah, obviously, in Lebanon. They still, in Iraq, are training Shiite militias. They have a power projection capability that is bent on, backing these groups. But what's interesting in the Gulf, in the states that I focus on, Saudi Arabia and in Bahrain, they stopped that policy in the 90s. They stopped stirring Shia. They stopped backing these Shia revolutionary groups in the 90s. So what you find now is that any Shia mobilization that occurs in Bahrain, for instance, the Pearl Roundabout Uprising, I mean, that was an indigenous, homegrown revolution that was inspired not by Iran, but by Tunis and Tahrir Square. The same thing in the eastern province in Saudi Arabia. So these Shia, when you go and talk to them, they say, well, we admire Iran. We look, with fondness on some of the clerics. We turn to them for spiritual advice, but they would not want the Iranian model applied in their own home countries. They don't receive training from Iran. So Iran is not behind this. But the Gulf states, of course, play that up. They try to say, look, we've uncovered this. And it's a classic case of deflecting responsibility, of, saying this is an external actor. I think, there are cases, and you are seeing instances. The Iranians were backing the Houthis in northern Yemen, which is a sect of Shiism. There are perhaps some instances they're back some of the more radical Bahraini actors, but it's not the sort of thing that really is the driving force.
So once I had a stimulation exercise in my class, it was like we were trying to write the constitution for Iraq.
Oh, wow.
Like proposing the constitution for Iraq, and we had to take different identity, like, and then we don't know like what the other people identity are. So I just know that I'm a Sunni, so I just knew that I own a lot of like properties like oil mines and things, and I'm a minority, but I have the generation of like the influence in the government and things like that. So it was really interesting. And then even though if we are not living in Iraq, or we won't gain or lose anything from the stimulation exercise, like when we discuss about like how we should like manage the constitution and how many seats are, or like some of them thought like the Shia, they thought like, oh, you guys have the like property, and so that you can get like better education. So if you just run the election, you would just like get the elections and vote. So we won't get it. So we have to have like a specific amount of seats in the Senate and everything. So they were proposing like that, and so all of us became so excited and nervous.
Right,
and
right.
just argued a lot. So I don't know. Do you think it is a good idea? Because like by implementing like this, like it will be more like we are encouraging the sectarianism and everything. Please feel free to correct like if my premises are wrong in my question.
No, that's a really good point. No, absolutely. I mean, there's a balance. You're absolutely right. I mean, there's a real balance between giving equality to sex and then deliberately or inadvertently encouraging those divisions. I mean, that's the problem with Lebanon, is the government is set up along confessional sectarian lines where there's a representation where seats are given, the prime minister is from one sect. Do you really want that? I mean, because then you're just perpetuating those divides. Iraq, I mean, the problem with Iraq is that what we're seeing now is, after Maliki left, is the U.S. is trying to say to the Prime Minister Abadi, be more inclusive in your cabinet. Okay, he's going to bring in a Sunni to do this, a Sunni to do that, a Kurd to do that. But that all occurs in the top level in the government. And what you find is that that sectarian representation doesn't really translate out into governance in the provinces. So much of the problem is not really sectarian representation at the elite level in the government, but it's evolving power to the provinces. It's ensuring Sunnis in the West have better rule. And so that's why I'm very leery of sort of formulas, for give the Shia some seats. It's not a good strategy for real government, and it entrenches those divides, as you mentioned. So again, not focusing on the sectarian representation, but rather, as I mentioned, rule of law, land ownership, judiciary reform, just the broad-based things. Yes.
How do you use your vast knowledge of foreign affairs? Do you consult with governmental agencies? Or do you work for a scholarly group?
Sorry, yeah, I do. I work for it's called the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So we're a nonprofit think tank, independent, no formal connection to the government. We were set up by Andrew Carnegie in 1910. We're the oldest foreign affairs think tank in the United States. So we have offices in the Middle East, China, Russia. So yeah, we do our own independent research. We take the results of that research. We meet with government. We try to persuade them. They read our stuff. They call us in for consultations. State Department, Defense Department. We testify before Congress. Whether we have an impact is another matter. So, but we do our best, and there's a whole science behind policymakers. Where do they get their information? Do they even read analyses? Do they come with preformed opinions? So I can't put my finger on one instance where something I've written or said has changed anything. So take that with it, So.
Yeah.
earlier that, you know, one of the Obama administration's big regrets was that it didn't do something different about Libya.
Right.
And I'd like to sort of ask you about that with respect to Iraq and ISIS.
Yeah.
Are there things that the United States could have done but didn't? Or is this one of those cases where we're fooling ourselves if we think that the United States actually has influence to direct things one way or another with respect to ISIS's popularity in the region?
Right. I mean, look, I mean, I was there in Iraq in 2003, and then I was there in 2008 as an advisor to General Petraeus, and that was when, as you know, the United States basically empowered the Sunni tribes to go after al-Qaeda, and then the deal was, well, they would be brought back into the system, they would get jobs, and you started seeing already in 2008 that wasn't happening, and we had a massive presence there at the time, and so this idea that if we had left more troops in Iraq, we might have been able to steer the Maliki government toward a more equitable policy toward the Sunnis, I think is a bit, I mean, I'm a big fan of recognizing our own limits. I mean, we're sort of a nation of engineers. We like to think we can go in and fix things, but I'm skeptical that had we done something different, we could have, you know, prevented this. I mean, governments in the region have a way of going their own paths, and we probably would have been implicated in Maliki's sectarian strategy had we been there. And so, you know, perhaps from an intelligence perspective, we did get caught a bit flat-footed in terms of anticipating ISIS's capabilities and their movement into Mosul. I mean, I was there in 2008, we declared al-Qaeda in Iraq was on the run, and it was like gone. The problem is these groups tend to reemerge, and so it's, you know, with Libya, I'm not sure that more troops there on the ground, would that really have made a difference, or would that have created a whole new set of problems in terms of a jihadist insurgency? I mean, jihadists flocking into Libya to fight the Americans there. So there's all sorts of different scenarios for that. I do think there could have been more in Libya in terms of the diplomatic end, in terms of helping the Libyans with their governments, not kicking it all to the United Nations and the Europeans. But again, we're living in the real world of politics, and I mean, this is a president that came to power with an explicit vision of dialing back the use of military force, of disengaging the United States from Iraq. I mean, I was there in Iraq, and I mean, it's, you know, we were exhausted as a military nation, so there's only so much we can do.
Yes. Beating this horse, but did the Department of Defense pay your agency for going over consulting with General Petraeus?
That was not my. This was not the current place I'm at. That was with the RAND Corporation, which is a different think tank, and they actually did pay us to go over. So they solicited our help to go over, and so we were paid by the government to go do that. Yeah.
So we spent a lot of time talking about these like formal political institutions and how the lack of these institutions like is creating a divide and preventing like progress towards like the unification of these two groups.
Right.
And I was just wondering like who's doing it right? Like where is the shining example of like these institutions like bridging these people together? Like where's the positive?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the problem with this region. Yeah. There is one case that I haven't mentioned a whole lot, and that's Kuwait. In Kuwait, the Shia comprise about 40% of the population. They tend to be better off economically. The Kuwaitis of all the Gulf countries, of all the Gulf monarchies, are probably, in fact, the most semi-democratic. They're the most progressive in terms of their ruling structures. They do have a parliament that actually works, that actually does exert some authority over the monarchy. The Kuwaitis have a constitution, and that's another thing we're talking about constitutions, having these formal documents that delineate the rights of citizens, the relationship between different bodies of government. So you find there that there are some sectarian tensions, there's protests, but the Shia, when you go there, you find that they feel better integrated. Much of this has to do with the history of these ruling families. The Al-Sabah family in Kuwait actually relied on the Shia families as a buffer, as a balance against Arab nationalism. So they were sort of using them as allies. So there's some history there that's unique to Kuwait. But I think it also has to come down to inclusive institutions, that they do have a parliament where the Shia can vote. They can, there are Shia representatives in the parliament that are answerable to their constituents. People see a benefit to, participating in government. These divides are not manipulated as they are in other Gulf states. If we're looking at the region more generally, not just in terms of Shia Sunni, but Tunisia, as you may know, is probably the one shining example that everyone is looking at after all of these Arab uprisings.
Just going off of that, how open do you think these people are going to be to institutions like that kind of coming in and trying to bridge a divide?
You mean like what? Like in what institutions?
Like the ones that you were talking about, maybe in Kuwait, or the more higher government institutions, or
right.
just how open do you think they'll be for in bridging a divide between Shiites and Sunnis, or the identity
right.
differences?
Well, look, I think what we saw from the Arab Spring is that the demand for some sort of say in government is not a Western that people want accountable governments. They want institutions that give them a voice. They want to transcend, tribal and sectarian identities. You saw these movements take foot. So I think we've passed that threshold. We're in an age where good governance is now a universal value. Inclusive institutions, rule of law, whether we call it democracy or whether it has to mirror our system. Hopefully not. So that it's sort of, I think people want that fundamentally. Even in Saudi Arabia, they're taking baby steps. They've had municipal council elections. They have a Majlis al-Shura. So these countries are moving at their own pace toward more representative forms of governance. But it's a question of, are these really reforms? Are they cosmetic? But no, many of the activists that I talk to, this is what they want. They want more transparent government. They want more inclusive institutions. But of course, authoritarianism is, it's deeply embedded in many of these states. A place like Egypt, they had elections. Now we're back to this authoritarian system, strongman rule. You do have in some of these countries a nostalgia for dictatorships. In a place like Libya, people are so fed up with the daily violence, with the daily chaos. Young people I talk to, friends in Libya, that they're looking back on the Gaddafi period with a certain nostalgia. They're saying, well, it was bad, we didn't have any freedoms, but at least we weren't getting kidnapped and carjacked. And this is a natural phase in revolutions, I think. There's always a period of it gets worse before it gets better. When I went to Iraq, yeah, sure. After Saddam, everyone was saying Saddam wasn't that bad. At least the electricity was on, and so, this is a problem.
There's something that was not mentioned or that did not come up that much, but that's the fact that a lot of these countries receive a significant amount of U.S. military aid, right? And almost especially in the case of Egypt, it seems to me that there seems to be a preference on the U.S. side for with the strongman rule, and that the political ambition and goals you talk about do not always match up the consistency with which that massive military aid has been provided. Don't you think that's an obvious channel or potential leverage that should be used for promotion of more democracy, more transparency, things like that?
No, this is a huge battle that I'm fighting every day, and no, I've written a lot on this. This is the story of this region, that we inherited an authoritarian set of states from the British when we came in the 70s. We were so focused on allying ourselves with these states against the Cold War. The Soviets and then it became Iraq, and then it became Iran, that we have such a massive constellation of military bases in the region, a network of military assistance. We've partners with these very authoritarian regimes. How do we extricate ourselves from that? Yeah, I mean, the Egyptian-U.S. military relationship is really predicated on preserving the Camp David Accords. That's the relationship there that we're focused on. But it's a real problem. I mean, we're giving President el-Sisi these Apache helicopters. He's using them in a very scorched earth and brutal manner in putting down an insurgency in the Sinai. Human rights abuses now in Egypt are far worse than they were under Mubarak. You know, and there's only so much appetite in the U.S. for pushing hard on this. It's unfortunate. It's a real problem, and it's what I've argued is it's creating new forms of extremism that will come back and bite us later on. I mean, it's unless we address it. But I mean, my contacts in the U.S. Defense Department, they get this. I mean, I don't want to paint the U.S. military as oblivious to this. I mean, there's some smart guys in the military who understand that, you know, the U.S. shouldn't be partnering with these states, that, yes, we're cooperating with them militarily against this threat, but meanwhile, they're treating their own citizens in this way, and these things could come back and bite us. And I mean, yeah, there are people in the U.S. Defense Department asking these questions. Should we withhold, you know, certain weapon sales until countries do X, Y, and Z? It's just very difficult to do that because the Egyptians can turn to other suppliers. When we did that in Bahrain, we withheld these armored vehicles, these Humvees, from the Bahrainis. We withheld some other munitions from them, and they just went to other suppliers. I mean, they said, okay, we're going to get them from somewhere else, and so the ways that these regimes can circumvent U.S. pressure. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious, one of the things you touched about was the possibility of, you know, kind of supporting civil society efforts in the region. And I guess I'm always curious about what that actually means in this kind of a context.
Right.
And what you see as being effective.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, well, and again, there's a long-running debate about whether this has worked, but I mean, civil society, I think, means, you know, alternatives to government. It's forms of association outside the official sphere. It's a lot of it's you. Huh?
How do you support it if you're the, you know, sort of U.S. policymaker?
They have what's called it was called the Middle East Partnership Initiative. It's now called the Office of it's got a new name, but you're really bringing a lot of it's funding, a lot of it's training. You bring these people outside the country, you give them training. You're bringing them on exchange programs. You're giving them settings to organize themselves. You're giving them space. You know, you're a skeptic of this, or you're.
I'm just not sure. I mean, I'm not sure how you measure its effectiveness.
Yeah.
Does setting up programs where, say, Bahraini students can study in the U.S. have to do with that same sort of tie into that policy initiative?
I think it's a huge policy tool that we have. For all of the criticism of U.S. policy in this region, consistently the polling shows that people are still attracted to American institutions, American values. They value education. Here we were talking about this. So. There's more Saudi students in the United States than ever before. Obviously, this has it's important, I think, from a value perspective, from American values, but it also has a sort of real strategic implication. I was sitting in a meeting with USAID, which is the branch of government that does this sort of development thing, and we were talking about radicalization and how does the USAID combat radicalization. And we had in the room at this table one of the premier scholars of terrorism. This guy is a leading scholars of terrorism, written books on everything, right, a PLO. Hard-nosed guy, I mean, thinks in terms of terrorism. And they said, what should we do to undercut terrorism, undercut the radicalization? He said, educational exchanges. It was interesting that this guy, out of all the things the United States can do, he was advocating education as a tool the U.S. can use to undercut radicalization. And I think that's significant. And is it always going to work? No. I mean, it's a very difficult operating environment to go to support civil society. But what we've argued is because so many of these regimes are partners, when we work through them, I mean, it's just very difficult to, because they're using the aid for their own purposes, they're compromised, they're not, I mean, you need to circumvent them, you need to go to the society directly. So.
Thank you so very much.
My pleasure, absolutely.